April 26, 1986. Chernobyl's reactor core explodes with the force of a nuclear warhead. Radioactive debris rains over Pripyat. And yet, Soviet authorities send children to school. Firefighters battle flames barehanded. And 36 hours later, as radiation soars, a May Day parade floods Kiev streets. This wasn't just a meltdown, it was a cascade of baffling, almost surreal decisions that defied science, safety, and sanity. Why did operators remove control rods when the reactor was dying? Why bury radioactive soil directly into groundwater? Why did graphite-tipped rods, meant to save the reactor, trigger its first explosion? For 37 years, evidence has whispered a chilling truth. Chernobyl wasn't just a tragedy. It was a fractal of human hubris. Today, we expose 9 strange things that never made sense, from the reactor's fatal design to the orders that sacrificed thousands. Stick around. By number 5, you'll realize the real disaster didn't end in 1986. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. The reality is the Chernobyl reactor was inherently flawed, and its staff were never alerted to this flaw. They remained unaware the tests they were running on April 26, 1986, might induce the reactor into a detonation scenario. Yet, despite this, the test which finally triggered the catastrophe was, by every report, inadequately conceived and badly managed. Previously authorized safety procedures were overlooked for the sake of speed, indicative of a systemic absence of safety awareness within the facility. Following an inquiry, the International Atomic Energy Agency determined that, when evaluated against the principle of safety culture, the endeavor was critically deficient not merely during operation, but at every single phase in the plant's existence. Decisions impacting safety were deemed dubious throughout all periods, covering design conception, engineering development, construction, equipment production, plus administrative and regulatory oversight. The test on Chernobyl's Reactor 4 aimed to establish if its backup mechanisms could function using rotational momentum following an electricity loss. However, immediately prior to the test being performed, the emergency core cooling system was isolated. It would stay that way for the entire period of the trial. The blasts that subsequently shook the facility were principally triggered by other errors. But the cooling system's unavailability worsened the circumstances and highlighted the facility's pervasive disregard for security protocols. While the initial test parameters required the reactor to be maintained at an output of around 1,000 megawatts, operator mishaps led to the level dropping to just 30 megawatts. This resulted in the reactor's core activity becoming unstable. Personnel worked to counter the reduced output levels, yet they only managed to recover to roughly 200 megawatts. At this output, though stabilized, the state remained highly hazardous. Tragically for all present, the actions the crew implemented to elevate the power output would immediately precipitate the disaster destined to engulf the plant. The Chernobyl test proceeded into the evening of April 25, 1986. Personnel grew progressively aggravated by their failure to increase reactor power output. To counteract this, they commenced extraction of control rods. Safety regulations mandated at least 15 rods remain inserted, yet staff continued removing them until only 8 were left. Consequently, the reactor dipped below the minimum operating reactivity margin, which is far from ideal. This produced a positive void coefficient, a tendency inherent to reactors of this design, which is also problematic. In essence, these actions rendered the reactor exposed to possible energy spikes, heightening the danger of a full core meltdown, the epitome of catastrophic outcomes. The test protocol mandated shutdown of the turbine engines supplying cooled water to the reactor. This step alone might have been manageable, but after battling to boost reactor power, the operators also decreased the feed water flow rate. These combined actions elevated the reactor's internal temperature and correspondingly, steam generation. Though various hypotheses exist regarding the immediate cause of the initial blast, numerous analysts contend it was this steam accumulation. Regardless, the steam at minimum amplified the reactor's instability. Personnel were striving to augment power in Unit 4 when they abruptly encountered the inverse issue, an enormous energy surge. While multiple theories exist, the precise trigger remains unclear. But whatever initiated it, the surge fractured the reactor's fuel elements and propelled temperatures to disastrous extremes. This subsequently produced even greater steam volumes. The expanding steam further intensified pressure, eventually rupturing the fuel assemblies and depressurizing the reactor's cooling circuit. Once this sequence occurred, the detonations destined to devastate the facility were virtually inevitable. As reactor power spiked, personnel scrambled to insert additional control rods, but the response was untimely. More critically, this effort to restore stability might have been a critical error. The Chernobyl control rods featured graphite displacers. In essence, substantial evidence indicates this graphite instigated a nuclear interaction with the fractured fuel elements. This concept accounts for the intensity of the initial blast, possessing sufficient force to lift the reactor's 2-meter-thick concrete and steel lid completely. A subsequent explosion, probably caused by accumulated hydrogen from steam reacting with zirconium, occurred mere moments later. While the first explosion dislodged the lid, the second propelled it into the air. Alongside it, significant amounts of nuclear fuel and moderator material were also ejected. At minimum, one individual, whose body was not found, perished immediately. A second succumbed in hospital only hours later. As though this were insufficient, the detonations exposed the reactor's core. Radioactive material started to permeate the Chernobyl site and subsequently spread worldwide. Considering the explosion's ferocity, alarms would seem imminent and the facility mobilizing urgently. Yet this was not the case. In reality, the initial reaction was remarkably calm. Operations at other reactors persisted normally. Even firefighters arriving to extinguish flames omitted wearing protective equipment. 2 personnel perished immediately following the event. 28 additional fatalities, mostly emergency workers absorbing massive radiation doses, were directly linked to the disaster. Over 100 individuals were hospitalized with acute radiation sickness. Several dozen more died in subsequent weeks and months. Roughly 2 miles, 3 kilometers from Chernobyl stood Pripyat. Its inhabitants received no information. However, they observed officers patrolling streets in respirators. Speculation circulated rapidly. Radioactive emissions were pouring from Chernobyl. But regional authorities, determined to adhere to official narratives of concealing the incident, delayed evacuating the town. The evacuation directive arrived only 36 hours post-blast. Citizens were allotted 1 hour to gather belongings and depart for what authorities claimed would be mere days. In reality, they were permanently barred from returning home. And owing to the postponement, they had absorbed indeterminate radiation levels. As though the early reaction to the Chernobyl catastrophe wasn't sufficiently dire. The containment effort proved chaotic, perilous, and laborious. Ultimately, over 6 months were required to stabilize the crisis. But by November 1986, a concrete and steel encasement was erected over the reactor. Responsibility for Chernobyl's management is widely shared. Yet significant culpability rests with Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership, whose responses were swayed by political expediency. The state was disintegrating, and none wished to recognize the calamity. Authorities delayed confirming the event for over 24 hours. Public notification took even longer. Emergency crews deployed to manage the crisis likely anticipated peril. Nevertheless, they couldn't foresee that inept choices would subject them to staggering radiation doses. Initially, officials employed robots to remove burning graphite from the reactor roof, but the machines failed. An alternative strategy used helicopters to dump sand onto the nuclear blaze from above. Not only was this ineffective, it subjected flight crews to radioactive air currents. Consequently, human personnel were forced onto the reactor structure, its core remaining exposed for prolonged durations. Authorities sought to limit additional atmospheric radiation by interring contaminated topsoil and plant matter. Yet this approach potentially yielded an unintended, though severely hazardous outcome. Specifically, while it may have prevented atmospheric release, it diverted radioactivity into groundwater. Per some reports, the cleanup bypassed regulations requiring geological assessments meant to avert exactly this scenario. Instead, teams excavated until reaching water and then deposited the soil directly into it. This likely disseminated radiation farther beyond the exclusion zone. The Chernobyl vicinity contained significant resources, and Soviet authorities were reluctant to forfeit them. They established dubious criteria for determining which foodstuffs were safe versus contaminated. Consequently, radioactive products appeared in shops. Vast amounts of tainted meat were even refrigerated, anticipating they might someday be consumable. The Soviet administration appeared unenlightened. They exhibited more of the egregious safety negligence that instigated the disaster. Mikhail Gorbachev reportedly learned of the meltdown hours post-event, but suppressed dissemination. Despite mounting global scientific scrutiny, his regime proceeded as normal. Radiation surged in Ukraine and internationally, yet the Central Committee hosted a major outdoor May Day celebration in Kiev. Their irresponsibility and hubris sacrificed innumerable lives. While Chernobyl's official death toll stands at 30, the World Health Organization attributes thousands of later cancer fatalities to the incident. By obscuring the crisis, the Soviet state deprived citizens of self-protection. The cover-up's true human toll remains incalculable.